Before dawn on the 29th of May, the air over the land walls of Constantinople is already thick with the smell of pitch and quicklime and the rotten egg breath of bad gunpowder. A bronze barrel 2 paces long has been firing into the same 500-yard stretch of masonry for 6 weeks. The Theodosian walls have stood there for 1,017 years. Tonight, they come down. Up in the breach, where the outer wall has collapsed into a sloping cone of rubble, defenders are stacking wine barrels filled with earth, beams, broken doors, anything to make a stockade where the masonry used to be. A man in dark armor, over a long Greek surcoat, stands inside the inner gate of St. Romanos. He is 49 years old. His boots carry small, embroidered double-headed eagles in dull thread. By the second hour after midnight, he will be on foot in the press near the stockade, sword drawn, fighting in the front rank alongside his Greek and Latin officers, and he will simply disappear into the crowd. No chronicler who was there can tell you the manner of his death. He is the last Roman emperor. A bronze cannon, built by a Hungarian named Orban, who had offered his services to the Greeks first and been turned away because the city could not pay him, is throwing stone balls weighing 1,200 pounds at the section of wall called the Mesotachion. The siege has lasted 53 days. The defending garrison, by the count of George Francis, who did the counting himself at the emperor's order, is 7,000 men, 4,983 Greeks, plus a little under 2,000 foreigners, defending 14 miles of land wall and 7 miles of sea wall against an army somewhere between 60 and 80,000 strong. By the 8th hour of that morning, both an empire and the longest-lived capital in European history have ceased to exist. This is the story of how a wall that had outlasted Huns, Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Crusaders finally broke in the eyes of a 21-year-old who refused to be called a boy any longer. It is the story of a gun and a chain and a small, unlocked door. It is also, and the chroniclers do not let you forget this, the story of an empire that had been one city for so long that no one alive could remember when Rome had been anything else. For 6 weeks, since the second week of April, that bronze barrel had been pounding the Mesotachian section of the land wall, the middle stretch where the ground falls into the Lycus Valley and the wall has to descend with it. The Mesotachian is the lowest course of the 4 miles of curtain between Marmara and the Golden Horn. It is the place an attacker chooses if he has any sense and an unlimited supply of stone. By the morning of the 28th of May, the great gun had brought down the outer wall opposite the gate of St. Romanos into a long, sloping cone of rubble. The defenders, working at night under cover of their own crossbows and the moon they did not have, had built a stockade across the cone, wine barrels packed with earth, beams torn from looted houses, broken doors, planks lashed with rope. By dawn on the 29th, that stockade is what stands between the inner curtain of Theodosius II and the largest army any Ottoman sultan has ever assembled. Ducas, writing in Lesbos under Genoese patronage, calls the campaign the capture of the city. Not a city, the city. After 1453, there would still be Greek-speaking towns. Mistra for 2 years, Trebizond for 8, scattered islands for 2 centuries. But no one would call any of them that. I will lean on 4 eyewitnesses for this story, and 3 of them have an axe to grind. Sphrantzes, the emperor's friend, gives the inside view. Ducas hates the Turks, and only slightly less the Latin merchants on his own side. Leonardo of Chios, the Latin archbishop of Mytilene, is hostile to the Greeks. Niccolò Barbaro kept a day-by-day diary in the harbour. The fourth, Critobulus of Imbros, is openly in Mehmed's service. They do not agree on the size of the garrison within 2,000, the size of the Ottoman army within 20,000, the length of the great gun within 10 feet, or whether a small sally port near the Charisian gate was left open at all. Where the chronicles fight each other, I will say so out loud. Where they fall silent, I will say that too. The siege did not arrive out of nowhere. Down in the harbour, in early April, when Mehmed's army first set up its tents on the open ground outside the walls, the chain, stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, was already in place. A thick iron chain on wooden floats, anchored at one end to a tower below the Acropolis of old Constantinople, and at the other end to a tower at Galata, the Genoese colony across the water. The chain had been laid out by the Megas du Lucas Notaras, who had also bought the wood for the stockade in the Mesoteikion, and who, before the next month was out, would be a corpse on the seafront, beheaded by Mehmed's order alongside 2 of his sons. The harbour boom was as old as the empire's wars with the Arabs. It had worked then. It would not work this time, but no one inside the city in April knew yet how it would fail. Sphrantzes, the emperor's protovestiarites, writes in his Chronicon Minus that on the afternoon before the final assault, Constantine walked the walls with him, gave him instructions for what to do with his children if Sphrantzes survived, and asked his forgiveness for any offence he had ever given him. Then the two rode to the Hagia Sophia for Vespers, the last service ever held in it as a Christian church. The defenders received communion in both forms, Greek and Latin together. Half the men in the nave had been at each other's throats about church union since January. Constantine slept 3 hours that night in his palace at Blachernae, near the corner of the wall closest to the Golden Horn. He was up again before midnight. He put on dark armour and the double eagle surcoat and rode south along the inner road that runs the length of the Theodosian walls. He inspected the stockade in the Mesoteikion. He spoke briefly with Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese condottiero from Chios, who had brought 700 professional soldiers in 2 ships in late January, and to whom Constantine had given command of the most threatened section of wall. Giustiniani had been the difference. 48 years old, the heir to a banking family that had served the Palaiologoi for 3 generations. Technically a Latin, and therefore for parts of the Greek population an enemy, he was the man the emperor trusted to die in his place, if it came to that. By the 3rd hour of the morning, Giustiniani would be wounded, in the chest, or in the leg, or in the hand, depending which chronicler you trust, and would leave the stockade alive. Within 12 hours, he too would be dead of his wound on a Genoese ship halfway to Chios. The chronicles are clearest on the moment immediately before the breach. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Ottoman irregulars, the Bashibazuk light infantry, the ones the Greek sources call useless and the Turkish sources call the first wave, attacked along the entire length of the land wall. They were beaten back without much trouble. An hour later, Anatolian regulars, Janissary trainees, Albanian conscripts, the second wave, pressed harder, and one of them, a man named Hassan of Ulubat, by Tursun Beg, writing 40 years later, climbed the rubble of the stockade and was killed on the parapet. Then, just before the third wave, came the moment I will return to in a moment, because everything that has been written about the fall of Constantinople in the 573 years since rests on what happened in the next 10 minutes. Two doors failed at once. The double-headed eagle on a pair of leather boots vanished into the smoke. To understand what happened at the Mesotachion, you have to understand what the city behind the wall had already lost, and how it had spent its last 150 years convincing itself that the wall would always hold. By 1453, the empire that called itself Roman owned the city, a strip of Thrace barely deep enough to graze cattle in, 4 islands in the Sea of Marmara, a third of the Peloponnese ruled out of the despotate at Mistra, and 3 towns on the southern shore of the Black Sea already paying tribute to the Ottomans. A century earlier, before the 2 civil wars of the 14th century and the loss of Gallipoli, it had been 5 times larger. 3 centuries earlier, before the Comnenian collapse at Myriokephalon in 1176 and the Fourth Crusade in 1204, it had still been one of the great states of the Mediterranean. What was left was the wall. The Theodosian walls had been built by an emperor too young to swing a sword. Theodosius II was 12 years old when his prefect Anthemios began the inner curtain in 408. By 413, it was finished. After the earthquake of 447, with Attila's army moving south through the Balkans, the prefect Constantinus added an outer wall and a moat in a frantic 70-day rebuild. The result was a triple barrier, moat, outer wall, inner wall, running 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The inner wall stood 40 feet tall, 16 feet thick, with 96 projecting towers. In the 11 centuries between Theodosius II and Mehmed II, that wall had been stormed once, by the Crusaders in 1204, from the seaward side, where the defences were thinner and the Greek emperor of the moment had lost his nerve. The land wall itself had never been broken by assault. It worked because of geometry. An attacker who took the moat still had 2 walls in front of him. A defender, forced off the outer wall, stood on a paved platform with the inner wall at his back, 4 arrow shots from his own archers above. The wall absorbed stone throwers, sappers, ladders. What it could not absorb was a single projectile heavy enough to reach the inner curtain in one arc and crack it. In 408, no such projectile existed. In 1452, one did. The man who came to the throne in Constantinople in January 1449 was the 4th son of Manuel II. Constantine Palaiologos had spent most of his adult life as despot of Mistra in the Peloponnese, fighting a slow-holding war against the Frankish principalities and the Ottoman vassals to the south. He was the kind of man who attracts careful adjectives in the chronicles and very few stories. Sphrantzes calls him pious, brave, plain-spoken. He had married twice. Both wives died young. He had no children. He had never been crowned in the Hagia Sophia. The ceremony was waived because of the unresolved fight over church union. And so, by the strict standard of his own court, he was, until the day he died, only the emperor in waiting. The day he died, he was 49. Or possibly the early hours of the 30th. Ducas counts hours after midnight, and Sphrantzes does not. The boy on the Ottoman throne was not new to it. Mehmed II had been sultan once already, between 1444 and 1446, as a 12-year-old, after his father, Murad II, abdicated. The Janissaries rioted. A Hungarian army crossed the Danube. Murad was recalled, and Mehmed was sent back to the harem to read Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, and to nurse a humiliation that 21st century historians have explained perhaps more confidently than the sources allow. Murad died on the 3rd of February, 1451. Within a week of taking the throne back, Mehmed had his only male sibling, the infant Prince Ahmed, drowned in his bath by a Janissary on his orders. Ashik Pashazadeh does not pretend this was anything but cold policy. Mehmed himself, in his later Kanunname, would write that the killing of brothers was permissible to maintain order and that God permits it. I read that passage 4 times. In April 1452, Mehmed broke 2.5 centuries of Ottoman precedent. He began building a fortress on the European shore of the Bosporus, 6 miles north of the city, at the narrowest point of the strait. The Greeks called it Limacopia, the throat cutter. The Turks called it Boğaz Kesen, which means the same. It went up in 4.5 months. By August, it had cannon on its walls. A Venetian galley, refusing to lower its sail at the new fortress, was sunk by a stone shot. The survivors were beheaded, the captain, Antonio Rizzo, impaled on a stake outside the gate. The blockade of the Black Sea grain ships was complete by autumn. The empire that had been one city for centuries was now one city under starvation. It is here that the Hungarian named Orbán appears, and I have to admit how much of what we say about him comes from one chronicler. Ducas tells it this way. Orbán, a cannon founder, came to Constantinople at the end of 1452, offering to cast guns for the emperor. Constantine could not pay him what he asked. Orbán crossed to Edirne, where Mehmed paid him 4 times the Greek offer and ordered the largest bronze cannon ever cast. Other Ottoman sources do not name him. Critobulus names the gun, not the gun founder. 2 later Italian sources call him a Saxon, not a Hungarian. The gun was real. Critobulus describes a barrel 27 feet long, with a bore wide enough for a man to enter on his hands and knees. 40 oxen and 200 men dragged it from Edirne to the camp outside the walls. The journey took 6 weeks. The gun fired stone balls of 1,200 pounds, 7 times a day at most, because the cooling between rounds had to be done with olive oil to keep the barrel from cracking. On the 2nd day of firing, according to Barbaro, the barrel cracked. Orbán repaired it. By some accounts, the next charge killed him. By others, he survived to the end of the siege. The Venetian surgeon notes both versions and does not commit. Mehmed himself camped in a red and gold tent on a low hill above the Lycus, facing the Mesotychion. On April 6th, his army began to dig the lines that would surround the city for 53 days. By Marios Philippides' reading of the Ottoman pay registers, and Philippides is careful here in a way Stephen Runciman was not, the field strength was around 60,000. 10,000 Janissaries, 15,000 Anatolian regulars, the rest irregulars and Christian vassals. Runciman's older figure of 80,000 is closer to the muster strength on paper before desertion. The truth is between the two. The defenders, by Sfranci's own count, were 4,983 Greeks and slightly under 2,000 foreigners, Genoese under Giustiniani, Venetian crossbowmen under their bailo Girolamo Minotto, a Catalan contingent under Pere Julià, and a Turkish prince in exile named Orhan, with a handful of followers on the Marmara Wall. Total wall length, 21 miles. Sfrances records stretches where, at the start, the men were so few they could only post a sentry every 15 yards. The harbour decided the siege as much as the gun did. The Golden Horn is a natural inlet 4 miles long. Its mouth is barely 400 yards across. The chain, a wrist-thick wrought iron chain on wooden floats, closed that mouth between the Tower of Eugenios and a corresponding tower on Galata. Inside, the Greeks and Italians kept 26 ships, by Barbaro's count. Outside, Mehmed had a fleet of 145 galleys by Ducas, 300 by Critobulus, 180 by Barbaro. Take Barbaro. He was in the harbour and counting masts. On April 20th, the Ottoman Admiral Bautaoglu attacked the chain with 7 galleys and was beaten off by 4 Christian carracks under Maurizio Cataneo, Giustiniani's brother Battista, and the Greek skipper Flatanellus. Bautaoglu lost an eye to a stone splinter and his command the same evening. He was beaten in front of the divan with 300 strokes and demoted to footman. 2 nights later, Mehmed had the answer. He had ordered, while still at Edirne, a road of greased logs from Tofane on the Bosporus over the ridge above Galata down to the Upper Horn at Qasim Pasha. On the night of April 22nd, between sundown and dawn, his crews dragged 70 ships across that road, over a hill 300 feet high, and floated them, masts already raised, into the Upper Horn behind the chain. Leonardo and Ducas say the Genoese of Galata knew of the plan and did not warn the city. Critobulus says they did warn it and were not believed. The crossing nobody disputes. The chain had not been broken. It had been gone around. Within a week, the defenders had to redeploy 400 men from the land walls to defend 3 miles of new waterfront. They never got those 400 men back. The wall was being talked about in the city the way men talk about a horse they know is dying. Sfrances lists the omens of the second half of May without comment. On May 22nd, the moon rose eclipsed, almost invisible, astronomically real, the lunar eclipse of that night, and the city took it as the breaking of the prophecy that Constantinople could only fall under a waxing moon. On May 24th, the icon of the Theotokos Hodegetria slipped off its bearer's shoulders in procession along the Mies. Several men tried to lift it and could not. A freak summer hailstorm followed. On May 25th, a fog dropped on the Hagia Sophia at noon. A fog in May, Sfrances notes, which does not happen here. And that night, the dome shone with a strange red glow that the Ottoman troops outside reported. Modern explanations range from St. Elmo's fire to a refugee fire lit from below by the gilded interior. The defenders called it the Holy Spirit leaving the city. By May 26th, desertion had become a real problem at the Mesetakion. Constantine ordered no man be punished for it. He had nothing to punish them with. A pause. If the slow source reading of the small things that decide whole centuries, the chronicles laid next to each other, the moments the wall holds and the moments it does not, is something you find yourself returning to, there is more of it on the channel, and more coming. Back to the wall, while there is still wall. On May 27th, Mehmed held a council. Halil Pasha, his Grand Vizier, the man who had served Mehmed's father, argued one last time for accepting the terms Constantine had offered through ambassadors: yearly tribute, recognition of the new fortress, free passage of Ottoman ships. Halil knew the Christian fleets in the Aegean and what a relief fleet could do to an army caught inside its own siege. He also knew, and we should not be too proud to say it, that he was a man of the old school in a court that no longer wanted him. Zaganos Pasha, the second vizier, a renegade Christian who owed his rise entirely to Mehmed, called Halil's argument cowardice. Mehmed listened. He decided. The general assault was set for the night of May 28th to 29th. Halil Pasha would be executed for treason within 10 weeks of the city's fall, on a charge of secret correspondence with the Greeks. The charge may have been true. The chronicles, of course, disagree. That same evening, on the Christian side of the moat, after the joint communion in the Hagia Sophia, Constantine returned to Blachernae, ate a small meal with Frances and a few of the Latin captains, and slept 3 hours. He had already given his last speech to the captains, recorded by Leonardo of Chios, a Latin paraphrase, almost certainly cleaned up by the archbishop, full of phrases too well-shaped to have been spoken in that room, and yet probably close to what the man actually said. Then he rode south along the inner road, back to where we began, the gate of St. Romanos. Dark armor, 2 small embroidered eagles on a pair of leather boots, the rubble of a 1,017-year-old wall behind him, and the bronze monster firing the first shot of the third watch from the Ottoman lines. The next 10 minutes are the ones every chronicler I have named will fight over for the rest of their lives. The third wave was the Janissaries, 10,000 of them, fresh, who had eaten and slept and listened to the Bashibazuk dying for 2 nights straight. They came in the pre-dawn dark in a column 8 men wide, along the road to the breach, behind drums and trumpets and the wail of the Mitterhane. Mehmed rode at the head of the column to the edge of the moat and dismounted there. Tursun Beg says he prayed aloud. Critobulus says he merely watched. Both agree he sent the Janissaries in and did not move again until the city fell. The stockade in the Messatakeion was a thing of barrels, beams, broken doors, and bound earth. Behind it stood roughly 3,000 men, Giustiniani and his Genoese in the center, with Greeks under the megas do on the inner wall, and Latin volunteers spread along the parapet. Constantine had ridden forward to the rear of the stockade an hour before. He was on foot now, behind the line, with Theophilos Palaiologos, his cousin, and John Dalmatos, an Anatolian Greek officer, and a Castilian knight named Don Francisco of Toledo, who had reached the city in March, and who would die that night beside him. The Janissaries reached the moat. The defenders fired everything they had into them. The first 3 rows died in the moat. The 4th row climbed over them. This was the moment. Now I want to slow down, because the chronicles do not. What happened next, in the chronicles that disagree about almost everything else, is told in 2 halves. The first half is the Messatakeion. The second is the Kirka Porta. Frances, Critobulus, and Barbero all describe the Messatakeion. Leonardo of Chios is the one who tells the story of the Kirka Porta. Ducas tells both. In the Messatakeion, Giustiniani Longo was hit by a projectile. The chronicles do not agree on the projectile. Leonardo says a crossbow bolt through the chest. Ducas says a handgun, lead ball, through the leg. Frances says a wound in the hand. Barbero, on the harbour side, says only that he was struck and carried out. Everyone agrees Giustiniani called for the gate of St. Romanos to be opened so his men could carry him to a surgeon, and that when the gate opened, a number of his Genoese, seeing their commander being carried out wounded, went with him.
The Genoese,
In the chronicles written on Chios after the siege, call it a routine evacuation. The Greek chroniclers call it the beginning of the panic. Ducas calls Giustiniani's departure the loss of the city. I lean towards Francis, who names it without judging it. The wound was real. The withdrawal of a famous condottiero would rattle any unit. But the breach itself had not happened yet. Then the breach happened. A small force of Janissaries, perhaps 30, perhaps 50, climbed the rubble of the stockade in the confusion that followed the gate. A man among them, named Hassan of Ulubat in Tursun Beg, and not named at all in the Greek sources, planted an Ottoman standard on the parapet of the inner wall and held it long enough for others to climb up behind him. He was killed in the next few minutes, struck by stones and arrows, and finally cut down. By then, there were several hundred Ottoman soldiers on the inner wall above the Lycus, killing the defenders from behind and above. The line at the stockade collapsed inward. Leonardo of Chios is the only chronicler who tells the story of the small door. He calls it the Kerkerporta, a sally port in the corner where the Theodosian walls met the older Blachernae wall, half a mile north of the Mesoteikion. Not a main gate, a postern used for sorties, for slipping men out at night to harass besiegers and bringing them back in. According to Leonardo, a sortie was led out through it that night. When the men returned in the chaos of the third wave, they forgot to bar the inner door behind them. Perhaps 50 Ottoman soldiers found it open, pushed through into the gap between the walls, climbed the inner wall from inside, and raised an Ottoman flag. Other defenders, seeing a flag flying above their own inner wall a mile from the main breach, assumed the wall had been turned from the rear. Marios Philippides and Walter Hannock, in their 2011 book on the sources, argued the story is essentially Leonardo's only. Kerkerporta is a Greek diminutive that no Greek source other than later writers copying Leonardo uses for any actual gate. They argue the wall broke at the stockade under the Great Gun. Stephen Runciman, in 1965, accepted Leonardo as an eyewitness on a piece of detail too embarrassing to invent. I lean toward Philippides and Hannock on the mechanism, but I keep Leonardo's small door, because what he describes, a postern left ajar in the chaos of the third wave, fits the architecture of that corner of the wall, and fits the way these things happen to soldiers in the dark. Constantine reached the area of the breach perhaps 15 minutes after the standard went up. He had ridden along the inner road, dismounted, gone forward on foot. He stripped off the imperial insignia, the purple cloak, the gold-edged belt, and went into the fighting in dark armor alone. Francis, who got this from Theophilos Palaiologos, his brother, who survived the night, records the emperor's last recorded sentence. __, quote, _0, __. He said it not as despair, but as command, asking his own officers to kill him cleanly, rather than let him be taken alive. Then he went into the press. He died on his feet. Theophilos Palaiologos died beside him, Daumatos behind him, the Castilian Don Francisco between them. Nobody in the chronicle tradition can identify the body afterward. The legend that Mehmed had Constantine's head brought to him on a stake and recognized it by the double eagle boots is in Ducas and only in Ducas, writing 9 years later in Lesbos with reasons to make Mehmed look exactly that ostentatious. I will not say he invented it. I will say he is one source and the others are silent. It was over by the 8th hour. The order to plunder for 3 days had been issued the night before. The chronicles divide into Christian and Ottoman here, and I will not pretend they balance. Ducas, Francis, Leonardo, and Barbaro describe the sack. The run to the Hagia Sophia, where between 4,000 and 10,000 civilians had taken refuge, believing the prophecy that an avenging angel would descend at the altar. The doors broken with axes around 9 in the morning. The women and older men dragged out. The sale of slaves on the steps of the Augusteion before noon. The murder, on June 4th, of the Megas du Lucas Notaras, alongside his 2 younger sons, on the seafront, when he refused to deliver his 14-year-old to Mehmed's household. Critoboulos says the sack was no worse than usual after a stormed city, and that Mehmed personally entered the Hagia Sophia later in the day, dismounted at the door, scooped a handful of dust onto his turban as a gesture of humility, and ordered the church preserved. Both things are true. They are not the same thing. A word on Critoboulos. He wrote a Greek history of Mehmed the Conqueror in the late 1460s, dedicated to Mehmed himself. Modern historians sometimes treat him as the least reliable eyewitness because of his patronage. I think that is wrong. He is least reliable on Mehmed's character, he flatters him constantly, and most reliable on the technical details, because he had access to Ottoman records no Christian writer did. Anyone who tells you the debt at Constantinople on May 29th with 3 significant figures is making it up. In the next 50 years, the consequences reordered the Eastern Mediterranean. The Black Sea, a Genoese trading lake, closed to Italian shipping by 1475 when Mehmed took Kaffa. Trebizond, the last Greek empire, fell in 1461. Rhodes fell to Mehmed's grandson Suleiman in 1522. Cyprus to the Ottomans in 1571. Crimea became an Ottoman vassal. Wallachia and Moldavia were pulled into the Ottoman orbit. The Hungarian frontier began the long slide that ended at the gates of Vienna in 1529, and again in 1683. In the longer run, the 200 years after the fall gave the rest of Europe a